Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for the afternoon session, or better, the session regarding the international perspective. We have the honor to have with us the public prosecutor at Padua Court, Silvia Golin. I see she's online.
Good morning, everybody. Good evening.
Perfect. As said, it's a great honor for us have you online with us today. Just a quick introduction. In your career, you have been appointed as vice prosecutor in Vibo Valencia, is a very hot spot in our country, and then in Vicenza and in Padua, and you are expert among the others in digital forensic and human trafficking. In particular, I should say that she led the OSCE exercise focused in particular on the international legal training, investigative cooperation, and protection of victims in the field, of course, of human trafficking in human beings, held here in our Center of Excellence. Ma'am, I don't have the intention to steal any valuable time to your day, because I know your day is very busy, and I give you the floor for your part. Thank you so much again for your presence.
Thank you for your very kind presentation, and thanks COESPO to have invited me on this very interesting webinar. I try to follow all from this morning, all the sessions. I just missed 1 hour because I had a trial, but thank you, because it was very interesting also for me. And I, with my speech, I try to presentate some legal consideration on international legal cooperation. So I would like to share a PowerPoint, if I am allowed. So I try to share my presentation. I would like to have a confirm that it's seeable and everything is correct.
Perfect.
Yes, we said.
Perfect. Thank you. So first of all, I am a prosecutor, so I share with you the consideration of a prosecutor, a public prosecutor, who need a lot of times to share data, investigative evidences with in an international point of view.
Ma'am, sorry to interrupt you. Is not in the presentation mode. If you prefer to have the whole screen in slideshow mode.
Help me to share. I did. I'm sorry. You don't see?
Yeah, we do see, but maybe if you can put it in full screen. I think it should be on the bottom right. There's a logo of like slideshow. I don't know if you can see it. So bottom right.
Wait.
Just at the end.
Like this?
Down?
Yeah, down. It's just on the right. Esatto.
I see.
Oh, maybe that one. Yeah, I think you can press.
Oh.
No. Wait.
No?
F5.
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 Here they say yes, F5.
Okay.
Wait. Okay, I try back. I do like this. I don't know. From my computer, it's
yes, and F5. You can try to press the button.
I did.
Okay.
Nothing happens from my computer.
It's okay, no worries. I mean, we can read it, so it was just to have a full screen, but I think it should be okay. No worries.
I'm sorry. I try back like this. No. No. I got lost. I don't know if somebody can take control of my screen or wait, hold. Gestisci pannelli? Could be?
Can we try? Yeah.
It's okay.
Sì.
I'm sorry.
No
If somebody could do it, we can also.
Yes, we'll try to do it. Wait.
You should click on this button of your presentation.
Hold. Show me.
This one.
Okay. All right. Okay, I do it.
Okay, now you should share again your screen.
Okay.
And then
Is it okay? Do you see? No. I did it, but it doesn't work because I am moving from your office computer. So maybe because I have just share.
Wait, I think still watching it Marco's screen, if you can.
Marco, if you please close your presentation.
Okay, I try back. Okay, I try back.
Yes.
Okay. So I hope.
Great.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay, I beg your pardon.
Grazie mille.
So going forward, I've been looking through some information through web, and I saw that African Union adopted the Free Movement Protocol in 2018. So we have a free movement of people, free movement of goods and money, and naturally we have the same free movement from the criminal side. So free movement of criminals, illegal money, and also victims of THB. Because we know that one of the objects of the traffic on human being is the movement, the use, the transfer of people that are sold as goods. So this globalization and this free movement creates spontaneous agreements between criminals to avoid controls or to transfer people or illegal goods or money through different states and to avoid investigations. Reading the great words of Kofi Annan in the foreword of United Nations, we can also that we can share even today. If crime crosses borders, so must law enforcement. If the enemies of progress and human rights seek to exploit the opportunities of globalization for their purposes, then investigator must exploit those very same factors to defend human rights and to defeat the forces of crime, corruption, and trafficking in human beings. So in THB, in the investigation of trafficking in human beings, we have a very high complexity because trafficking of persons, particularly women and children, for forced and exploitative labor, including sexual exploitation, is a crime that usually attacks economic migrants. So we have natural moving people that are taken by criminals. And THB is a financially motivated crime. Annually generates an estimated 150 billion US dollars in profits. And also we have another thing. THB is a crime that usually spreads around different countries. And this creates difficulties on investigation because of the discrepancy between national different definition of crime and its interpretation, and different national investigation procedure. So one chance is given by joining investigative efforts to collect evidence by bringing the criminal phenomenon back to its unit, according to international cooperation. So we need common strategies. And we need common strategies to promote and harmonize national legislation to fight against international crime and to protect human rights. An example is the European adoption of the Convention Against Trafficking in Human Beings, which was adopted in Warsaw in 2005 and adopted by all UE members. A second is to exhort states, the single states, to sign international cooperation treaties, like UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. And then we can also have another way, adopt a common procedure to realize faster international cooperation on criminal matters, like we have in Europe, the UE investigation order, which is a faster way to communicate between different states. So we need mutual assistance in criminal matters, especially in crime against humanity. We need it because we need to fight and prevent crime against human rights and to harmonize different national legislation. We need it because of a faster and easier cooperation to investigate transnational crimes, to prevent criminals from escaping prosecution simply by leaving the territory of the state concerned. And we need it also to attack illegal assets transfer abroad. We have to remember that when we have an international convention, we need also that a country signed the international treaty, and then afterwards the state must adopt internal legislation to implement the national legislation through the agreement, the international agreement, to change the national law to make the cooperation really existing. So judicial cooperation centers around obligations that are accepted by states parties. The states need to collaborate with each other on punishing certain crimes that are defined by international criminal law. And the states need to cooperate to harmonize national legal frameworks to an international level. They also need to cooperate to collect and exchange information to prosecute criminals, and also for extradition, which is the legal process to transfer a prosecuted person from one state to another to face a trial or to execute a sentence, a guilty sentence. There are different ways to realize international cooperation. The first is the spontaneous cooperation between police of different states, but it's very, very based on volunteer cooperation. Another way is the creation of a common police department between, like in the European Union, we have Europol with specific capacities and specific expertise on certain matters. Then we have the possibility of multilateral agreement, like UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime in Palermo. Then we have the bilateral agreement, the agreements, international agreements, which are made between two states, like Italy and Morocco, to the legal cooperation agreement on carrying out sentencing and extradition of criminals that was signed in Rabat in 2014. So, so I give you an example of what happened after Brexit. We have Great Britain that was in the European Union and now is not anymore in our union. So Brexit still has cooperation with Italy or UE members because of other treaties that were signed by the Great Britain. And also, according to the speech that was made this morning by Isabella Mozzaki, I agree that it's very important nowadays, to create a platform, to create ET tools to help to realize a faster communication and exchange of information between judicial authorities. So I bring you an example of what UK made for mutual legal assistance, just to bring an example. Then we have, as I just said, the most convention on cooperation between different states. The United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, signed in Palermo, the 15th November 2000. This convention is the main international instrument to fight against transnational crime. The states are obliged to take measures against transnational organized crime, including creation of domestic criminal offenses, like participation in an organized criminal group, like money laundering, like corruption and obstruction of justice, and also to adopt new and sweeping frameworks for extradition, for mutual legal assistance and law enforcement cooperation in the promotion of training and technical assistance for building or upgrading the necessary capacity of national authorities. I saw that the African Union countries are almost all of them they signed the United Nations Convention. So what is very important, and in this page you can also have the link to look at the signatory states. So what is very important is not only to sign an international treaty, it's also to make it effective, to make and create and adopt national legislation to follow what is the international obligatory politic also decision of the state. We know that UN Convention is supplemented by 3 protocols which target specific areas. And we have, first of all, the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, women and children. And then we have the second protocol, which is against the smuggling of migrants by land, sea, and air. And the third, the protocol against the illicit manufacturing and trafficking in firearms and components and ammunition. So country must become party of the convention itself before they can become party of any of the protocol, which give each one a certain specific procedure or definition of organized crime. So what is the main point? The main point is that we need to have transnational offenses. We need to have crime that move through the states. That's why we need this mutual legal assistance to hear victims, witnesses, to follow a certain procedure, and to find evidences that can be shared in different states with different regulations. The aim, of course, is to harmonize national legislation and to fight organized crime. So the UN Convention spreads around a lot of criminal offenses. As I said, participation in an organized criminal group, laundering of proceeds of crime and money laundering, criminalization of corruption, which is the main index of the link between organized crime and abuse in the institutions. International cooperation for purposes of confiscation, seizure and confiscation of goods that are connecting to a crime that are transferred abroad. The criminalization of obstruction of justice, which is as corruption a grave crime that, of course, always is connected with organized crime. And also the protection of witnesses, which is very important, especially in crime as THP. In the traffic of human beings, the first need that a judicial authority has is to have the declaration of the witness, of the victim, but at the same time protect the life and the family of the witness, even if she or he lives abroad. And then we have mutual legal assistance and extradition. The protocol that is the first protocol to the UN Convention, as I said, is made to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons. So this is the first global legally binding instrument with an agreed definition on THB. The intention behind is to facilitate convergence in national approaches with the regard to the establishment of domestic criminal offenses that would support the efficient international cooperation in investigating and in prosecuting THB. Also, one of the objectives of the protocol is to protect and to assist the victim of trafficking in person with the full respect of the human rights. So this is very important because, as I just said, the common definition of THB helps each state to create the domestic crime to punish and to give effective protection and to fight the trafficking in human beings. Then now I'm going to give you certain small, I'm going to go faster because I think my time is almost run away. So in the next slides, you can see I did some slides very specific, which I don't have the time to read to you all, but I leave you if somebody is interested to read them. Some specific characteristic of UN Convention, Palermo Convention. First of all, the convention says that all in the country we have to have the dual criminality. Mutual legal assistance is connected to criminality of the same offense from the two different countries. Also, mutual legal assistance is confidential, must be kept the secret of investigation, even if this investigation are made from a different authority, of course, to prevent the investigation and the effectivity of all the investigation that have to be made. Then we have the list of what can enter in the ask of a mutual legal assistance. So we have the collection of evidences, the execution of searches and seizures and freezing orders. And then we have the capability of identifying and tracing proceeds of crime, and all type of assistance that is not contrary to the domestic law of the requested state party. Of course, it's important to say that OS int we mean open source investigations like social network investigation. Everything which we can find in the web doesn't need mutual legal assistance, because it could be made by the police that works in this country. We don't need to ask to a different country. We have to ask to a different country, to listen to a witness that we can reach because it lives abroad, or to, made a confiscation, a seizure in a different state. Then in this slide, I make a list of what are, all the requests that are necessary to send a mutual legal assistance. We can also hear witnesses or experts through video conference, which is really easy and fast and very important to collect an important evidence as the listening of a witness. We also have the possibility to make joint investigations, to collect bilateral or multilateral agreements to create a joint venture for a complex investigation through different states. Then also there is the possibility to create special investigative techniques, like use of controlled delivery and use of special investigative techniques as electronic or other forms of surveillance and undercover operation. Of course, it's possible, as I said, to ask a mutual legal assistance to confiscate and to make seizure of certain goods connected to organized crime. So I hope with this PowerPoint to give you and to share my knowledge about what mutual legal assistance in our, for all the country that signed United Nations Convention. Even if I always say that it's very important to, to create, to coordinate, to exchange, to find the way to reach the other authority, judicial authority of the other country where I have the interest to investigate and to create directly contact using this important convention. Hoping to give you some interesting news. I thank you again for having me in this webinar.
Thank you so much to you, ma'am. I must short the question. Is a recurrent question today regarding the Palermo Protocol. You mentioned the implementation of national legislation, but what about the countries they didn't sign the convention?
This is a politics. This is a politics point. Of course, we can also make a comparison between European Union, which is also a union of different states, like African Union, and different timing on receiving all European Union decision. No, for instance, we can also see that in Europe we have different time on having national legislation on what European Union suggested. So of course, this is a politic problem. This is a political problem where a union like African Union could, use a political suggestion, a political but of course, everything is demanded, is left from the country that has to sign the convention. At the same time, we also have countries that signed the convention and maybe they don't have effectively made the implementation of national legislation according to the convention. So it's a political problem that we need to push to make a better world.
Indeed.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much also for your time, for your presentation. Is a very particular point of view. The point of view of the prosecution, the prosecutor is significant, is different from the others, and I would like to thank you once again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much again, and if you allow me, we'll go to the next briefer. So, next briefer is Lieutenant Colonel Marco Sutto, which is one of the most appreciated teachers of our Center of Excellence here at QESPU. He's an expert of training of international and national police officers for the deployment in peace support operations. He's also a lecturer in international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and related issues, and he's the United Nations point of contact for QESPU's resident courses. His substantial expertise in United Nations policies on vulnerable people, such as children and civilians in conflict, would be an added value to our day. So, Lieutenant, the floor is yours if you want to start with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear and also see me. Can you hear me? Yes? Good.
Yeah, we can see you.
Now I'm going to share my presentation because I don't go anywhere without a PowerPoint presentation, but I guess it's very common today. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. So today I'm going to briefly introduce human rights and international humanitarian law. So the title of the presentation is Human Rights International Standards. In the previous presentation, we have heard many times about human rights, about the importance of human rights. With my session, I would like to highlight what are the key features of human rights from a legal perspective. So I would like to start, first of all, defining what are human rights and what's the definition used by commonly used by UN. Essentially, human rights are recognized as the most fundamental rights of human beings. They are defined as the rights that every human being has just by virtue of his or her human dignity. And essentially, they work defining the relationship between the individuals, each one of us, and the power structures. I mean, the states. Human rights at international level are codified and recognized by a specific branch of law, okay, which is the international human rights law. And needless to say that the UN Charter is a sort of milestone, cornerstone in this branch of international law. And that's the reason why I would like to quote some passage of the Charter. First of all, we find mention of human rights in its preamble. As we know, the UN Charter is the founding document of the United Nations, so it was written in 1945. So I mean that the time in which it was written, the time in which the United Nations were created is relevant because we know how the world was broken at that time. And so it is amazing to see that that time the international community agreed on some principles agreed on recognizing human rights as a key element for guaranteeing peace and security. In the preamble, we see that the United Nations were created and were determined to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and in the dignity of the human person. And essentially, what is very relevant, in equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small. There are many other parts in which the UN Charter mentions the human rights. And I would like to quote just the two of them, Article 1 and Article 55. In Article 1, the Charter says that among the purposes of UN, there is the promotion and of the respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms, again, for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. And in Article 55, again, UN commits to promote the universal respect and the observance of human rights and fundamental freedom, again, without distinction. I said, and I wanted to quote these parts of the Charter because it represents a milestone in the modern human rights asset. But it's not the only part which is relevant, because the UN Charter recognizes the importance of human rights, but it does not give a list of human rights. We needed to wait 3 years the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It was adopted the 10th of December 1948 by the General Assembly, okay, and it was drafted as a standard of achievement for all people and nations. Essentially, the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, sorry, with its 30 articles, identified 30 fundamental human rights. Okay, so thanks to this document, we nowadays we say that there are 30 fundamental rights recognized at the international level. The UN Charter, together with the Universal Declaration and with other two very, very important covenants, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, they represent the core of the international human rights law, and they are referred as the international, altogether as the International Bill of Rights. Of course, there are many other treaties and conventions, but I have to say that they are not introducing new human rights. They are just dealing with the human rights that were already recognized by the Universal Declaration, giving them more space, or committing states to do something more for their protection. That's the example of the Palermo Protocols. They essentially do not introduce any new human rights, but they just deal with human rights that were already recognized to let the states better protect them. Now, I've in this slide, I've written some example of human rights, but I would like to skip this part because we already know all of them. What I wanted to say is that when we deal with human rights, we have to consider that they have key characteristics, all of them. First of all, and we have already mentioned this, they must be considered as universal, meaning that they belong to everybody with no distinction, no gender distinction, no sex distinction, no language or whatsoever. They are applicable in peace and even in wartime. We know that when there is a conflict, IHL, international humanitarian law, is applicable, but still human rights are works. So they still are applicable, and they have to work together with IHL. Another key characteristic is that by law, human rights are inalienable. It means that they can be violated or they can be abused, but they cannot be legally taken away from a person. Again, another feature is that they are all interdependent and equally important. Human rights depend on each other. If you abuse, if you violate one of the human rights of a person, there will be repercussions on the enjoyment of all the others. Okay, and we have experienced that recently with the pandemic. Okay, to protect our life and our health, our institutions imposed curfews, and we have experienced how a limitation of our freedom of movement have impacted also on our health and in our enjoyment of the right to life. And last but not least, human rights, we must remember that human rights are legally and internationally guaranteed. So we're not speaking about, policy, we are speaking about laws. Actually, we have already said that international human rights law defines the relationship between individuals and power structures. And international human rights law defines what are the state responsibilities towards the citizens, towards the individual who are living under the jurisdiction of a state. Because states have a duty to uphold people's human rights. And as states are not physical entities, states are represented by people who are working for the state. States are represented by police officers, by soldiers, by judges, prosecutors. These individuals who are covering such positions, they are duty bearer. So they have the duty, okay, to uphold people's human rights. We could say in another way that states are responsible for protecting the population and addressing their needs. And this obligation is rooted in the international human rights law. Just to mention it, Article 28 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms of the Charter of the Declaration can be fully realized. It means that each one of us has the right to have a functioning state, a functioning international community, which is in charge of guaranteeing our rights and our freedoms. Essentially, we could decline states' obligations into three types of obligations. The obligation to respect human rights. So first obligation is not to be the perpetrator, not to be the author of human rights violations. The second obligation is to protect human rights, to protect individuals' human rights from abuses committed by other individuals. Okay, so the states have the obligation to respect, the obligation to protect, and the third type of obligation is the obligation to promote, to fulfill, meaning to create day by day better conditions for the enjoyment of human rights. Said so, and said that states have obligations, the United Nations, the international community also recognizes that states have different situations, different economic capacity, different culture, different historical background. And so it applies to the positive, it is applicable to the positive obligations of the state, so the obligation to protect and to promote human rights. It is applicable, the so-called principle of progressive realization. Essentially, this principle obliges states, okay, in accordance with the respective economic capacities, social and cultural traditions, okay, but always observing the minimum international standards of human rights, to establish targets and benchmarks in order to progressively realize the positive obligation, in order to progressively become a better protector and a better promoter of human rights within its jurisdiction. Of course, we must also say that in implementing these three obligations and in recognizing and protecting human rights, states could experience exceptional circumstances, and states could have the necessity, okay, to temporarily suspend or limit some human rights. Okay, this is perfectly legal. It is recognized, but only under certain conditions. Okay, the first condition is that the state should be in a public emergency, which is so serious that it is threatening the very life of the nation, the existence of the state itself. Okay, the emergency must be also officially declared and made known to the population. And last but not least, okay, the measures were implemented to limit or suspend certain rights must not cause discrimination, okay, on the basis of race, color, sex, or whatsoever. This possibility to limit human rights, to suspend certain human rights in exceptional circumstances, and when I say exceptional circumstances, I mean armed conflicts or serious natural disasters or events like the one we lived a few years ago, a couple of years ago, a global pandemic. Okay, there are limits to the suspension of human rights. In fact, certain rights, okay, cannot be limited or cannot be suspended at all. And when I say that certain rights cannot be limited or suspended, I refer to the so-called absolute rights. Okay, the international human rights law recognizes that some few human rights are so-called absolutes. These rights are the freedom from torture, I put it in the slides, freedom from slavery, freedom from imprisonment for inability to fulfill contractual obligation, prohibition against the retrospective operation of criminal laws, and right to be recognized before the law. These rights cannot be limited for any reason. No circumstance justifies a qualification, meaning an interpretation or a limitation of these rights. Okay, there's no emergency, there's no war that can legally allow a state to limit these rights. Of course, there are all the other rights that can be limited or suspended, and these rights are divided into derogable, meaning that they can be suspended temporarily, or non-derogable, meaning that they can be limited but not completely suspended. All these type of limitations on human rights, of course, or any type of activity the state implement to protect, okay, or promote human rights must not discriminate. So when we speak about human rights protection, when we speak about human rights promotion, we must remember that everything, all activities are based on a so-called non-discrimination pillar. That's because what we have seen historically is that the worst human rights violations have resulted from discrimination against a specific group. And discrimination, when we deal with human rights, has been described by the High Commissioner, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, as the act of making unjustified distinction between human beings based on the groups, classes, or other categories. Okay. Another good description of what means discrimination has been defined, has been used in the Convention against all forms of discrimination against women. In the Convention, Article 1 describes discrimination against women as any distinction, exclusion, or restriction made on the basis of sex, which has the effect or purpose of impairing or nullifying the recognition of the enjoyment or the exercise by women, okay, of certain human rights. So we see non-discrimination is essential. Non-discrimination, it doesn't mean that states cannot apply different measures, but these measures, okay, should have a positive goal, should have a positive purpose, okay? So when we have different measures, okay, who are applied, okay, to accelerate or to fill the gap of human rights enjoyment, okay, of specific group, these are positive in nature and these measures are allowed. Otherwise, they should be considered as discrimination. I would like to now to conclude my intervention, my speech, okay, just with a question: why human rights protection is so important? Why we speak so much about human rights monitoring, human rights protection, human rights promotion? Because abuse and violation of human rights linked to conflict, both and human rights violations and abuses can be seen both as a cause and a result of conflicts. Okay. For the UN, we know that respect for human rights is a foundation, the only way for obtaining a lasting peace and security. And lastly, I would like to close my remarks quoting the former Secretary General Kofi Annan, okay, who once said that humanity will not enjoy security without development. It will not enjoy development without security, and humanity will not enjoy either without respect for human rights. So I thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'm open to your questions or remarks. Thank you very much.
Marco, good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation, for your time also. And I think there are no questions. Then I move to the next briefer. And if Ms. Alessandra Morelli is online, it's with sincere pleasure to introduce her to you. Alessandra, good morning.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. I'm online and I've been following since this morning.
Good morning. Just a few words to introduce you. Yes. In her long, outstanding career, she has been directly involved in negotiation and complex humanitarian operations, ensuring protection and assistance to refugees and IDPs. She has been deployed in too many countries: Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Albania, Kosovo, Guatemala, Sri Lanka, uncountable, consolidating the first emergency intervention also in Greece, where more than 1 million people were fleeing from the cruel war in Syria. She was directly involved in the dialogue with various government, NATO, international and local NGOs, and intergovernmental organization, and she defines herself a woman of dialogue and mediation. In particular, she has been senior officer for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees from 1992 to 2021. She ended her career for the United Nations in September 2021. She should be retired, but their engagements in academic meetings on human rights and humanitarian diplomacy are countless as well. She will speak about civilians in conflict zones, caught between two fires, and with a great pleasure, I give you the floor. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, and a very warm thank you for COESPU, for the organizers, to allow for this moment of reflection, which will not be a time where I will share any PowerPoint presentation, but it wants to be taking everything that has been said a little bit into the practical talking and sharing that comes through my experience. So talking about protection of civilians for an officer like me who has been indeed deployed in what we define the high-risk environments of this world, and have seen through the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Twin Towers how warfare has changed, how military engagement on the ground has also changed. Maybe can contribute in making the reflection a bit more practical. So indeed, my experience has been in high-risk environments, and especially in countries where counterterrorism was the main, if you want, aim. So, well, Somalia, still today, counterterrorism is one of the main issues. If you look at Afghanistan, for many, many years, the US and the allies were deployed to fight counterterrorism. All the Horn of Africa, and not to mention the Sahel, to also remain in the African context. I've been serving in the Sahel context as I have been serving in the Horn of Africa context. My last mission was in Niger, and so the Lipta Gourma, the Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso. So it is inevitable as a senior officer, I was responsible for these countries, for the High Commissioner. It is inevitable to reflect and think how protection of civilians is really conducted on the ground today, and what is the impact really of civilians in such an environment that is defined most of the time as asymmetric, where you don't have really one part of the conflict or one part of the actor in the conflict as your interlocutor, as your mediator, to make understand what the international frameworks that we have been discussing so far are really intended for. So basically, the reflection can be asymmetric warfare and protection of civilians, counterterrorism and protection of civilians. This is maybe an idea on how to develop further our thinking, because warfare has changed. We cannot deny it. Peacekeeping has changed. We cannot deny it. When I say that warfare has changed, is the targets of warfare has changed. More and more, we have to say this very openly, more and more civilians have become the target of such a warfare. If I think about terrorism, terrorism has the main objective of terrorism is to terrorize. And what a better way to terrorize than to terrorize the civilian population, destabilized, show to the civilian population that the government has no control. And I saw this in Niger, I saw this in Afghanistan during Enduring Freedom, I saw this actually everywhere, no distinction of colors in the war. The war is really equal everywhere. The suffering of people is everywhere the same. Maybe it's the only horrible thing that unites. I can tell you, it's just the same. And I saw with my own eyes that basically the capacity, the intent and the capacity of terrorist groups, call you Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab or the Grand Sahel, as you wish, the objective is to erase any point of contacts or point of referral in a community. It can be a doctor, it can be a teacher, it can be whoever has a role of responsibility in the community. So it's basically the beheading, symbolically speaking, but also reality of any point of referral to inject chaos and fear. And what is the reaction of the civilian population? Well, the reaction for those who remain alive is to move, is to create movement, is to seek protection elsewhere. Either this protection is a movement internally to the country, or this protection is seek to a movement that crosses an international border, or is a mix of the two. It is so complex today for the civilians to seek protection that in many countries, many are maybe even maybe representative in this forum today, you see a mix of movements. I saw it with my eyes when I was in Somalia, where you had Somalis still seeking protection in Yemen while Yemen was starting its own war. So you have refugees caught in wars in the countries that are starting. And you see this type of movements. I see it in the Sahel. I see Nigerians moving to seek protection into Mali, and you still have Malians seeking protection into Niger, meaning fleeing at least as much as you can from the proximity of the fire. This is chaos when we talk about protection of civilians. And this we have to admit that for people that are working on the ground is what we see every day. But protection of civilians goes hand in hand with protection of humanitarian workers. Because when we talk about protection in the humanitarian world, is a little bit different than when we talk about protection in the political world, in the military world, or in other contexts. In the humanitarian world, protection of civilian also means humanitarian access. And most of the time, the humanitarians do not enjoy humanitarian access, meaning that it's closed. And most of the time, closed by not only the threats of the attacks on the humanitarians, because the humanitarians today have become primary target, because if we are hit, we basically play in the hands of terrorism or whatever gang is there to gain control of the territory. Well, you see, I've been serving in Somalia between 2012 and 2015, beginning of 16. And my organization at that time, UNHCR, we were also the target, the UN, I would say as a whole, of a terrorist attack happened in K4, very near to the Medina Gate in Mogadishu. This for what reason? Just to say, we want to continue to create chaos. We don't want you here to stabilize what we are trying to destabilize every day. And the same in every humanitarian organization can count its killed in its structure, in its family, where every year we should never forget. On the 19th of August, this is what we do. We remember the ones who lost their lives in protecting civilians. So the lines are very, very blurred. The lines are blurred. And I can tell you also the experience in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, where you had a village of Tamil people.
Perché deve rompere l'anima? Un'altra volta si è disconnesso.
Scusi, very sorry. Must be an interference.
Please. Yes.
Yes.
Sorry. So sorry, Mrs. Morelli. You can.
No, not a problem. Not a problem. Yeah, it's not a problem at all. If you look at the situation in Sri Lanka, those days where still the Sinhalese, the government army was fighting the LTTE in Sri Lanka, but it's common in many other countries where you are fighting terrorism. You have villages that had Sinhalese villages, Hindu villages, and Muslims villages, one after another, right? One after another. What is the problem for the civilians in countries that are fighting counterterrorism? Is that the civilians are really caught in between the two, because the terrorists, they move on the ground and they try to move through the community, and they try to shield themselves sometimes into the community, right? As an act of force most of the time. because to say that civilians are all terrorists and they're all hiding terrorists, it's also a theme that one has to reflect a lot, because it puts in danger. But then you have the army that moves at the same time into that villages in the recce patrols, and the civilian is caught in between. The day before is the terrorist groups that are passing, the day after is the government troops that are passing, and the civilian is in between and targeted by the same stigmatization. You are collaborating. So the terrorist group says you are collaborating with the army says you are collaborating with the terrorist groups. So, and the same is in the Sahel. I have seen people fleeing their country, their village, just because of the confrontation between the two groups. So I would say that talking about protection of civilians today, with the changing nature of warfare on the ground, it is essential to review the posture, and essential to understand what education and what training to give on the ground to the soldiers. Many times, many foreign soldiers passing in a village to seek information has created for us, in particular UNHCR or the ICRC, that has a specific mandate on protection of civilians, especially refugees and IDPs, has created many times embarrassment and difficulty to reestablish equilibrium in that village. So many times in the training I had, is there a problem with the microphone on? No?
No, we can hear very well.
So many times in the pre-deployment training or in theater training that I was conducted, especially with multi-forces, if you want, international military presence on the ground, really on how to listen and how to enter in dialogue with the village was extremely important to avoid exactly what I was saying now. I understand the seeking of information, but attention not to put a village in danger. It happened that after such, if you want, movements or visits to villages, the next few days, terrorist group would enter that village and flatten down the village, literally flatten down the village. So today, protection of civilians is, yes, within the legal framework that we have discussed since this morning, but how, as they say in French, ça vaut la peine, vale la pena, it is necessary to also imagine the adaptation in contexts that are becoming more and more asymmetrical and more complex. Today, a conflict is complex, is no more the front line vis-a-vis the front line. Today is the villages. Today is where people live. Today is schools. Today is clinics. You understand? So this, at least, is my experience as an officer on the ground that had to basically preserve the space of asylum, first of all, negotiate it, and then preserve it. So it is all about creating protection space and preserving that protection space, knowing that in asymmetrical warfare, which is a little bit my, unfortunately, I have to say, my specialization, terrible to say, I would have never wanted to be an expert in these matters, an expert, attention, a witness more than an expert, somebody that from the field today interrogates her experience and translates it into testimony. That's how I would like to define me. Experts is nobody is an expert because humanity is such a complex matter, but a testimony, yes. So it is really important to really review, for example, protection of civilians, humanitarian space that opens and closes, all the issue in the humanitarian world of stay and deliver, despite the threats, despite us being the target. And the other very important issue is convoys, humanitarian missions with escort or with no escort? Are we becoming more a target with escorts, military escorts? Are we not? Are we more in danger without an escort? These are all issues that also from the humanitarian side we continue to think and we continue to analyze in order to give a better protection to the civilians. Most of the time, because of the inaccessibility of a location, it is literally impossible to ensure protection of civilians. Now, of course, protection of civilians is the main responsibility, we have heard it today, of the state. But most of the time, the state has no access away from how can I say, the balloon protected space of their own capital. So this is another issue that needs to be put in place. I'm just giving some suggestions on how the situation in reality on the ground looks like. And what is the reaction? The reaction is the movement of population. And I use this scenario when I make understand youngsters and educate to tolerance why people flee. Why people flee. You might not flee just because your village has been hit. You flee also because you think it will be hit. You flee also because the air that you're breathing is intolerable because full of fear. So it's a preventive movement. The preventive movement is also allowing preventive movement is also ensuring protection of civilians when I talk about refugees and IDPs, but also for all, because a refugee and a displaced person is first of all a civilian. It's not that it's another category. It's a civilian that becomes something else because of violence and fear. So basically, protection of civilians today, where are we at? The state of protection of civilians today, where are we at? It's not only terrorism. It's not only counterterrorism. Let's look at Europe. Let's look at the war between Russia and Ukraine. Schools, hospitals are bombed. So we are in the midst of the full violation of IHL, international humanitarian law, human rights, wherever is the engagement. So it's a question today, it's a theme, è un tema that we need to seriously take stock and seriously readapt in most of the circumstances, readapt. De facto, 90% of the casualties today are civilians. 90% of the casualties, of the hit, of the impacted in warfare are civilians. This is dramatic. I conclude by saying, and what have we done? What do we try to do? First of all, when you are in front of such a situation, well, the first reaction is to discuss with both warring parties. But again, sometimes, most of the times, you have only one side. You are missing the other one. And this is what makes it extremely complex and extremely difficult to protect. So when we say mediation, when you say conflict resolution, these are very important tools that you have in your kit that you have to put in an operational mode, but most of the time it is extremely difficult because you don't have another side. So you try to advocate remotely. You try to reach consensus remotely, but it's extremely difficult. The result is that today, 100 million people are uprooted because of violence, either because they are refugees or internally displaced people. And the great majority of the internally displaced people are concentrated in areas where we know that conflict is still ongoing. The other element that is important is that protecting civilians becomes more and more challenging because warfare is protracted. We are no longer into a situation where you have a 6 months war. Today, we are 30 years in Somalia and the Horn of Africa. We are over since 2012, even a bit before in the Sahel. Yemen, God knows when it will end. Syria, we are in the 11th or 12th year. And Ukraine, Secretary General Guterres said, we have to go through it in 2023. We have passed the benchmark of 1 year. So the more the war is protracted, the more the impact on civilians, not only dead casualties, but trauma. Let's not forget these human components. Traumatized population that will find it extremely difficult to produce and to be, just to be in the future. And where is the most tragic is that more and more we have lost mediators along the route. Today, we don't mediate. Today, we delegate to the embargo and to the arms to resolve a conflict. We have lost that capacity to engage with mediation. Okay, so that is also to put on the table to show how protection of civilians becomes more and more a challenge. Probably I've been a bit too harshy, but I think it was important also to bring the perspective from the field, how challenging it is, despite the excellent tools that we all have heard about, but then in reality, because of the changing nature, on the very, very fast changing nature of warfare, it is very, very difficult to adapt. So what is the solution? To continue doing what we're doing, educating, and educating without losing sight. So thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mrs. Morelli.
Thank you so much from my side. Also, before passing the floor to Colonel Bianchi for a question, I would like to thank you so much for the particular emphasis you put in your intervention. Your personal experience has been remarkable, unique, I would like to say, including also the multiple existing challenges you faced during your long career. So from my side in particular, thank you. Thank you so much for what you say. Sir, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Morelli. You mentioned a lot of very, very interesting points based on your experience on the field, also especially on your experience as a UNHCR head of mission. But in terms of increasing the level of awareness of the military and police components, what are your suggestions? I mean, in terms of pre-deployment training, because you mentioned that sometimes it happens there is a lack of cooperation or awareness among the military and police. I referring to the international military and police components in the peacekeeping missions and the humanitarian institutions. There are a lot of humanitarian institutions, as you know, UNHCR, but also the different NGOs. So the question is, in terms of pre-deployment training, what are your suggestions? Because we are very concerned about that, because we perform a lot of pre-deployment training for UN, but also for EU and different international organizations. What are your suggestions to improve the level of awareness of our military and police personnel before their deployment on the ground? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very, very much for this very pertinent question. It is an area that has always interested me because, of course, wherever I went, I met not only, of course, the national, but also the international as we say, boots on the ground. I think the best thing to do is exactly what we have been doing right now among us, is to bring the real experience from the field, is to create a space where in the pre-deployment training, we give space for the testimonies, and especially understand what is the structure that we have in place in that specific country that allows for coordinating and systematized civil-military cooperation, because this is what we are talking about, civil-military cooperation. Because also conducting civil-military dialogue in countries at high risk, namely the counter-terrorist environment countries, has also needs to be balanced extremely, extremely well in order not to blur the lines between who we are, who the militaries are, etc. There's always a way for cooperation. I was always the first one to push for it. I was known in UNHCR to be the person that establishes very quick and productive civil-military cooperation, but it has to be balanced. The issue of the escorts for the humanitarians is just an issue. Escort yes, escort no. So my recommendation is, let's take one or two countries and let's analyze what we have in theater as a structure to create this dialogue or to enhance this dialogue, what protocols countries have signed in loco. I say this because we have produced one in Niger, because we felt the necessity as humanitarians to have regular meetings with the international presence as well as with the national Nigerian forces. So my advice is this: let's look at the places that of interest for your pre-deployment trainings and catch up what is the structure we have on the ground and what can be ameliorated, but especially to be trained, to inform the new soldier that is going on the ground that this already exists and can be of use.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you so much again, Mrs. Morelli, for your incredible insight on the experience that you had. Thank you so much.
It's not from an academic point of view. It's just really from the heart, and with the aim to ameliorate and to reinforce altogether what has been started here. Thank you so much.
Thank you again. It was a pleasure.
I will have to leave you now. I will have to leave you, so I have another engagement.
Oh, thank you so much again. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye to everybody and good work.
Thanks. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's move to the next briefer, which is Mrs. Luisa Gatteschi. You see she's online. Let me just introduce her a little bit. She's currently working as Program Development Specialist at IDLO, which is the International Development Law Organization in Rome, in which she is responsible for program development and resource mobilization, as well as planning role of law-related activities and entry points with the African Union. As an economist specialized in social development, international economics and cooperation, she has substantial expertise in project and program management and coordination, project proposal preparation and evaluation. She has also extensive experience in working as a program coordinator and project manager, with various NGOs and humanitarian agencies working in Kenya and Ethiopia, as shown by her curricula, on both projects focused on humanitarian and social protection, public finance, inclusive education, and the implementation of monitoring of rehabilitation services. So it is with great pleasure that I leave the word to you, Mrs. Gatteschi.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction and thank you for the invitation. I may add that I have been working also on Somalia, which is relevant for the this presentation, and have been mentioned before, I see also from colleagues. So let me try to share the screen. I prepared the presentation, but I'm not too familiar, so please confirm if you can see the screen. Should be okay now?
Yes, perfect. We can see it.
Okay,
Thank you.
great. So I would like to do a premises. So this presentation is about the social protection mechanism. Social protection also from the policing point of view. Social protection, it's it's a mixed system, including elements of human rights, elements of social cohesion, and the elements of institutional presence in a country. We'll see later how it can be declined. My title, as a bit of provoking, is since is related to social protection applied to vulnerable groups as an alternative to dependency culture. This laid down in my experience as a donor with Italian development cooperation, during which I had the chance to develop the first social protection policy in Somalia. Dependency culture, so I'm talking about policing and the donor perspective that can be applied to the environment in which you also collocate your anti-crime activities in a more wider sense. Dependency culture is something that among donors has been considered and all the problems, but refer to international development cooperation during the 80s and 90s, in which we see money, this flow of money in support of vulnerable population, in support of disaster, in support of famine, but without a structural perspective and the structural capacity building to prevent problems. Social protection is a more modern concept. It's a concept that can overpass this old dilemma, and it's a concept that it's really important, still underestimated, but really important for the social stability, for the social cohesion, and therefore the prevention of criminal activities. Because just to and then I start with a presentation, sorry, but I would like to do this premise with, we know with the context of Somalia, for example, the problem of recruitment and adhesion to the Al-Shabaab group is very found in the lack of alternative. So let's go a bit more in details. What is exactly social protection? Social protection is considered as a set of interventions, so can be varied intervention and also interconnected, with the objective to reduce social and economic risk. We are talking about predictable risk, so risk that every human being can experience throughout a lifetime, throughout a life cycle that related to health, that relate to loss of income, that relate also to unpredictable risk like disaster and pandemic, as we have seen in this year. This intervention try to reduce this potential risk and provide a basic social security to all the citizens. It's very important, the concept of state and citizens in the interpretation of social protection policing. Of course, the focus is on vulnerable groups, because by their definition, they are the more needy of this kind of intervention. It's important to notice that social protection as a concept and as a system has been included clearly in one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is the goal 1.3, that call for implementation of nationally appropriate social protection system and measures by 2030 to achieve substantial coverage of the poor and vulnerable, first of all, of course, and then it's supposed to be expanded to all the population. It's important to notice this because social protection is embedded in different kind of development intervention. So not only in the policing or in the capacity of the state to produce, to provide the welfare, to give a most simple and intelligible example, but also in many other typical development intervention, like the poverty safety net, the intervention in which, for example, we have support for education and some others. So it's a concept already existing, but needing to be further developed and especially at national level. So from an institutional perspective, from member states of the African Union. The kind of social protection program, I'm sorry, I hope you don't see my view. Okay, sorry. The kind of social protection program mainly are three. We have the social assistance program, which are featured by transfer conditional or unconditional, sometimes also public work program, usually financed by government budget. We have, so basically able to support the most poor and vulnerable. At the same time, we have the social insurance program, which are programs designed for contingencies. So, for example, the loss of work, unexpected a sickness, or other trouble, let's say, that can affect the welfare or the income of an household or a component of an household. And we have a typical related to labor market protection. So again, we have unemployment benefits or very important, the creation of skills, so the capacity building, the so-called VET, vocational training, etc. What is important to notice about all of these three kind of programs is that they can be funded by different means. Some of these instruments are usually typically funded by government budget. So the government should be able to collect revenue and to allocate part of its budget for social protection tools and coverage. Some of these are based from contributory schemes. So, for example, the social insurance, the unemployment benefits, which are a scheme in which the employer or the citizen contribute for a certain reason, for the collection. So the concept is very similar to the concept of a general insurance in which everybody commit to protect the rights of the collective welfare. Sorry. Okay. Going to the benefits of social protection, these are really important to be analyzed to understand their real impact and the level of interconnection about the instrument and the benefit for the citizens. First of all, social protection is conceived and address the reduction of poverty. Of course, the increase of income or the protection of households favor better living conditions, better livelihoods, and reduce poverty, in turn promoting social inclusion and dignity of the vulnerable population. This is very important because, again, we have an hint to the human rights-based approach. Also, the colleague Sotto was mentioning before. So we have elements of inclusion and dignity of all the citizens in the society. This is not only about promotion of human rights, because more inclusion, more dignity, in turn, contribute to the building of political stability and social peace. It can not seem, I would like to stress this point because it's not maybe really evident, but social protection has a strong element towards what is called the social contract. We have from a side the collective, the community, and from the other side, the government. If the government commit to provide this kind of social stability, social service, and social insurance, it increases its legitimacy, in front of the citizens, and it favors a more cohesive, a more stable, and more peaceful environment for the society. So we will have less inequalities, but also less tension, less violent conflicts, and as I said already before, less addition, less recruitment, less space for criminal organization and the terrorists to interfere in the society and to recruit people. This is very important, as we mentioned already here and there, the counter terrorism and social protection. It's not an abstract concept or system that has no connection with such a strategy. Further, social protection contributed to economic growth. Of course, the raise of income increased the consumption and the investment at all levels. This is, it goes without saying. And it has also another interesting aspect in the promotion of human development, because cash transfer facilitate access to nutrition, health, and education. How it works, simply children, for example, that it's a risk of dropout from school if the household is supported with the money, will continue to go to school instead of going for labor, so we can decrease the rate of child labor. Or, for example, a pregnant woman can access to health care and we can decrease the maternal mortality rate. I'm trying to summarize a bit because I see already took some time. So we have also the increase of productivity and employability, because of course, with a more structured market for labor, we have less informality, we have a possibility to train workers, and then we have a possibility to have a private sector with workers from a high skill, not only low productivity level. We have a protection, of course, against shocks, pandemics, and what, as I've already mentioned, and the protection of the human rights, which are for every citizen. I would like to call your attention on, I'm sorry, okay. Okay, my computer take the lead. Okay, I would like to call your attention on the diffusion of social protection of the world, in the world. Of course, there are initiatives like the Universal Social Protection launched by the UN, which try to build a consensus and to increase the diffusion of social protection mechanism in all their declination and all their interpretation. But if we look at the data from ILO of 2016, and we see that very few parts of the world have accurate and adequate level of social protection coverage, mainly Europe and Australia, where we range around 80 and 86. That is a data almost closer to the universal coverage. In the rest of the world, let's say in Asia and South America and Northern Africa, we have an average of a coverage of 50% on average, ranging from 47 to 61. That still is not enough, but substantial, at least half of the population is covered. But if we come to Central Asia, but especially Sub-Saharan Africa, we have a data of 13% coverage of population by at least one social protection benefit. So at least one of all the available one. So 13%, if we compare this data with the latest data of poverty rate in Sub-Saharan Africa, we have a poverty rate of 86%. That means the discrepancy is huge and needs to be filled, because out of 8 person, let's say, in poverty, recognized by World Bank, we have only 1.3, so let's say one person covered by certain support. Of course, this is a problem also for the reaching out of this kind of category, because of course social protection needs a structure and the central government able to reach a citizen, but still the data is too low, and still there is room to fall again in what is the assistantialism, assistance and dependency for the citizen. About the diffusion for category, very briefly, we have only 35% of children in the world receiving any kind of benefit, and this is very risky again for the labor dimension. Only 41% of women are receiving maternity benefit. Only 22%, which is a very low data about unemployment protection, and only 28% of persons with disability receiving some benefit again. I would like now to go to a bit of focus on what has been my experience in the creation of the first social protection policy in Somalia. As a background, that was a project strongly conceived and funded only by the Italian Agency for Development Cooperation and in collaboration with UNICEF and WFP. The ministry, the competent ministry at the national level, which has been our main stakeholder and has worked hard for 1 year and a half on this, was the Ministry of Labor. The Somalia context, as you know, and as has been mentioned also by other panelists, is a very peculiar one. It's a state that came from a protracted crisis and unfortunately still ongoing. Is a state with a very high rate of IDP, and is a state in which the legitimacy of the government is still questioned and in trouble. At least this was the situation at the time. The policy therefore started from a phase of assessment of the situation and from a study on the element constitutive of the policy able to incorporate a strategy and elements of a strategy to develop, a long-term and structured approach. So, first of all, which were the requirements of this policy as identified in the feasibility phase? It was the trade-off between long-term objective, and so we are in the field of predictable risk, predictable funding, long-term objective, and the balance with chronic and seasonal risk. For example, just to say one, we know we have very often drought in Somalia. So a trade-off between the element of long-term and the seasonal risk. Another element, it was a trade-off between the resilience and durable solution and the flexibility of the deliverable mechanism and funding. And the last trade-off, they are all, sincerely, they are all interconnected, but I'm trying to call your attention on 2-3 areas, 2-3 elements. And the last is about the realistic elements, so population that can be reached, population that is in need, and they found on the transfer existing. Among donor communities, there were many talking at the time about the social poverty safety net, so already assistance provided, the cash transfer provided, diffused, sometimes duplication and initiative. And the idea of this policy was to mainstream and to coordinate this aid system to have some standards. So, for example, the value of a transfer to have standard, but also to have a long-term view and not on spot, on demand measure. Of course, the policy was also supposed to be inclusive, cross-regional and cohesive, but this is a cross going. I can't, of course, talk about the overall policy in detail now, but going to the principle that we identified, and I will be happy to respond to any question or provide information further. We identified some principles that can be easily applied also to some other countries and cases, especially members of African Union, state member of African Union. I can say can be easily applied because if we develop this in a so complicated context like Somalia, with a great result, can be a good opportunity and can be a good inspiration also for some other countries. So, of course, the policy was national ownership, was characterized by national ownership and leadership. That means that it was government-led, and the government bears and assume and commit of a primary responsibility of provision of social protection to Somali citizens. There are agencies, there are donors, there are international community, there are other actors, but the leading actor of the overall process is the government, going back to the social contract I already mentioned. We have a comprehensive and a flexible scheme, so the need to have a mix of coverage for predictable needs, as we already said, like the human rights, the education, the health, the employment, and others, and also address coverage risk. We have the right and responsibilities based, so progressive realization of human rights, which should be a constitutive aspect of any social protection policing and tools, because of course the idea and the principle of no one left behind applied very prominently to the social protection policing. We have equity and social inclusion, so of course, neutral, non-discriminatory, and very important aspect, again, especially in development context, we have the integration and coordination. So program and other intervention provided by donors, provided by agency, provided by NGO, provided by religious actors, provided by military, provided by a range of actors should be coordinated because vulnerabilities are multifaceted and the context is of multi-response, but should be in a coordinated manner. Otherwise, we can't capitalize and build on the benefit of such an intervention. Partnership, of course, I already mentioned, all the actors should be included as much as possible, and the beneficiary also needed to be consulted and involved. Very briefly, last point about capacity building, social protection, the establishment of a social protection policy, systems and tools, even if infant, even if the beginning, require in turn the government to invest in human and technical resources, require operational system, require, for example, the institution of a social registry, which were done in Somalia. So to know how many people, to know which category, to know where they're based, and to make the government able to talk with the beneficiary. As a key reflection, and then I conclude, I think I already took 5 more minutes on my time. And going back to what is the international development debate, one of my key reflections is that the development of social protection policy, especially in Africa, should be increasingly funded by state-owned budgetary resources originating from revenue collection. Of course, this is not easily achieving. This is not immediate, but it will be an element that will favor the switch from an international to a locally owned perspective. Member state of African Union has the revenue base, has the capacity to increase the revenue base by providing services to citizens, has the capacity in future to increase the legitimacy resiliency by providing also social protection through the appropriate and the adequate provision of social protection tools. This is not only a vision, but it's something real, it's something already ongoing, and it will be good to increase the focus and to develop new solution to strengthen this ownership of social protection. And then, as I already said, this will increase the legitimacy of the state for citizens and create favorable conditions for social stability. Again, I mentioned we need not to forget that social instability led to crime and to all other problems you already treated and discussed more in details. And third, social protection facilitates resilience, since it creates a multidimensional response to multidimensional vulnerability. So it addresses different aspects and different problems, boosts resilience in the population, indirectly, directly, indirectly, by the work, by the creation of economics dynamics. It has many repercussions, positive repercussions. The boost of resilience make concrete what donor community call the humanitarian and development nexus. So the need to address the emergency, the need to support the vulnerable, the need to support the IDP, the need to support the famine, but also the need to look at the development perspective and merge these two aspects. And social protection, it's a very powerful instrument to empower population, state, and to achieve this objective. So I stop here, and thanks for your interest. Apologize for taking a bit more.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Gatteschi, and thank you again for your incredible insight on the social protection, especially in the topic of protecting vulnerable communities. I think it gave an incredible insight on especially your experience with the Somali perspective. Thank you again. Thanks. And I will pass the word to my colleague.
I think we are getting to the end of this webinar. I'd like to turn it over to the last briefer of the day, Lieutenant Colonel Elizabeth Coffey, United States Army Civil Affairs Officer, currently stationed with Africa on J56. Lieutenant Coffey has a significant background.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
You have a significant background, having covered several civil affairs team lead position in Niger, in Kenya, in Somalia, in Iraq, as well as a company command of a company aligned to the Baltic and Ukraine. I don't want to spoil any point of your presentation. It's my pleasure to give you the floor for for your presentation. Please.
Thank you, sir, and really appreciate the opportunity. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear.
Okay. Sorry, I am in an office and there may be some background noise, so I will appreciate that. And then my work camera has no, my work computer has no camera, so I apologize about that. But thank you so much for the thought-provoking discussions we've had so far and the nice introduction. I am stationed up here in Germany at Kelly Barracks. I'm going to discuss 3 areas with you today where not only AFRICOM, but the Department of Defense addresses vulnerable populations. The first two reside within my directorate, the J56, the Civil Affairs Branch, and the Humanitarian Assistance Branch. And the third will be the discussion of the newly appointed Civilian Harm Mitigation Response Action Plan by the Secretary of Defense in August of 2022. Also, I'll focus briefly on a civil affairs vignette, which you can see displayed to demonstrate how civil affairs teams assist the resiliency of local governance partnerships to strengthen vulnerable populations. So With that, just a quick overview of my office. I'm a planner at the J5 Directorate here at U.S. Army AFRICOM on a planning team with 5 civil affairs planners. We currently cover current and future civil affairs planning. We manage civil affairs management for African continent and develop the civil affairs operational picture for the AFRICOM theater in line with the AFRICOM campaign plan. Our operational planning is at the strategic to operational level, working with our subcomponent commands to resource and provide guidance and planning initiatives to the tactical civil affairs teams within AFRICOM and the AFRICOM steady state realm. Our tactical civil affairs teams provide insight and perspective on vulnerable regions and populations utilizing civil reconnaissance and engagement activities within local populations to identify potential partners and perspectives on potential resources U.S. AFRICOM can dedicate to support vulnerable populations. So I could direct your attention, please, to the slide. This is a vignette that I'd like to highlight from our subordinate command, Special Operations Command Africa. This is a recent civil military operation conducted in December of 2022 in the Danaab village outside of Kismayo, Somalia. And it's highlighting the integral on-the-ground relationship our tactical civil affairs teams have with the Somalia National Army, SNA, specifically the 5th Danaab Special Engagement Cell, and the local governance leaders of the Dalsan village west of Kismayo. The operation, coordinated by the Civil Affairs team, assisted the mayor of the village and the SNA to garner goodwill with a vulnerable population in the distribution of vital civic aid. The village received a half-ton of purchased goods, such as immediate food and relief items, followed on by a later, larger USAID donation. And also, the leadership of the region, Mayor Dalsan, spoke at the event to unite the clan leadership of the region and promote goodwill and unity. The effort was further emphasized by local public affairs venues such as Radio Kismayo and the 5th Danaab social media posts that they posted online to enhance the pro-federal government of Somalia sentiments in the region. The civil affairs team regularly conducts efforts, our civil affairs teams within U.S. AFRICOM regularly conduct efforts similar to this vignette across the African continent to provide not only vital civic assistance, but also work with governance and military leadership to enhance vulnerable populations' security and trust of their local leadership in these susceptible regions. Also within our directorate is the Humanitarian Assistance Branch, who utilizes humanitarian assistance projects to assist vulnerable populations. In steady state operations, what we consider phase 0 of the shaping operation, U.S. Africa Command uses the Department of Defense humanitarian assistance projects. These projects consist of collaborative DoD engagements with partner nation government authorities in permissive environments to directly relieve or reduce human suffering, disease, hunger, or privation, or to increase the partner nation capacity to provide essential human services to vulnerable populations. Our humanitarian assistance projects are commonly developed jointly with the partner nation ministry-level authorities and include activities such as construction, training, planning, the provision of equipment to address disaster risk reduction, mitigation, and preparedness, health-related projects and activities, basic education support, and basic infrastructure. While the projects serve as a humanitarian purpose to primarily benefit the general civilian population, we do not execute them for humanitarian reasons, as the UN, USAID, or NGOs do. We do them to show our goodwill to gain access and influence within a country. Also, in case of a disaster, we have forces ready and resources nearby. Our commander, the U.S. AFRICOM commander, has the authority to conduct life-saving activities for the first 72 hours of the disaster. The President may direct the Secretary of Defense to provide disaster assistance to respond to man-made or natural disasters when necessary to prevent loss of lives or serious harm to the environment. Otherwise, if the U.S. government's assistance is requested, typically for a natural disaster, USAID will be the lead federal agency. U.S. Africa Command would only assist if formally requested by USAID through the State Department. Also, another program that we have at our disposal here is in post-conflict areas, we can leverage our Department of Defense Humanitarian Mine Action Program, which provides assistance to the partner nation civilian populations plagued by landmines, explosive remnants of war, and hazardous effects of UXO, by developing indigenous partner nation capacity through training and equipping for humanitarian demining, the land basing and underwater explosive ordnance disposal, and physical security and stockpile management of conventional munitions. So that is all within my department here. And then I'm going to also touch on a third aspect that is newly appointed Civilian Harm Mitigation Response Action Plan by the Secretary of Defense in August of 2022. So in addition to what we've described, the civil affairs and humanitarian assistance sectors at the combatant command level, the wider Department of Defense recognizes the need to protect civilians as a moral imperative to mitigate and respond to civilian harm to reflect our American values and contribute to achieving mission success. And listening to Ms. Morelli's point earlier of 90% casualties on the battlefield are civilians, that's why our Department of Defense decided this was an important thing that we needed to do. So the Department of Defense recognizes the criticality of improving efforts to mitigate the harm armed conflict causes civilians. The department is committed to prepare to prevent, mitigate, and respond to civilian harm in current and future conflicts. They will do this by integrating civilian protection into DoD mission objectives, prioritizing protection and restoration of the civilian environment as much as the situation allows, and will ensure operational commanders are supported with institutional resources, tools, and capabilities that contribute to the protection of civilians, assessing and learning relevant lessons from the operations, and appropriately responding to civilians harmed as a result of operations. In January of 2022, just recently, U.S. Secretary of Defense Austin issued, last year, Secretary of Defense issued the Civilian Harm Mitigation and Response Action Plan Memorandum to direct the civilian harm mitigation and response activities to commence. The DoD published the plan in August of 2022, and from this point, the Department, service agencies, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, Space Force, and combatant commands have begun to work on implementing the tasks from this plan. The Department of Defense is developing more detailed instructions on how to implement, which is to be published any day now. The Civilian Harm Mitigation Plan will revolutionize how the DoD mitigates and responds to civilian harm. First, it will define civilian harm to be broader than casualties. The department wants to understand all the ways in which civilians are harmed by military operations. The Joint Staff is relooking military doctrine to take in civil considerations better into account and develop a better understanding of the civil environment, which will then span into strategy, plans, orders, and intelligence within the DoD. The department will hire people specifically focused on ensuring that we mitigate and respond to civilian harm and will address and challenge operational and planning assumptions used in the past. The department will appoint civil environment teams that help the DoD better understand populations, assessment cells to document positive and negative lessons learned, and the DoD will investigate where there is an incident resulting in civilian harm at the appropriate echelon. Lastly, the Department of Defense appointed the Army, the U.S. Army, to establish a civilian protection center of excellence to create training requirements, reach back experts, flyaway teams to support as needed, and it will be institutionalizing the advancement and knowledge of civilian harm mitigation in general to the DoD. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to discuss these three topics with you. My civil affairs realm, our humanitarian assistance realm, and then the wider Department of Defense civilian harm mitigation plan. I open up the forum now to questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth, for your very interesting overview. Pass the floor to Margherita.
Yes.
Please.
Thank you. Yeah, just to wrap up, thank you so much, Elizabeth Coffey, for your amazing experience. Thank you for sharing your amazing experience with us. I'm just gonna sum up and just show, talk about a little bit of the final wrap-up of this session, this webinar. So first of all, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin once more by expressing my profound gratitude to all of you for attending this first webinar on the protection of vulnerable groups in domestic policing and peace support operation in the African continent, which was only made possible thanks to the great partnership between the COESPO Center and the African Union Commission. We are sincerely appreciative of all the presenters that dedicated their time and knowledge for creating truly engaging and extremely fascinating presentations. And I'm sure they contributed to bring awareness to the delicate and critical subject of safeguarding vulnerable groups. I want to show my deepest appreciation to the COESPO Center, first of all, for allowing me to assist today as co-moderator. It has been a pleasure working with you today, such an experience. Additionally, thanks to everyone else in attendance here at COESPO, all the colleagues for their contributions and questions of today's webinar. But finally, last but not least, I would like to thank all the attendees who decided to join us today from all over the globe. I have to say that your engagement is highly valued and appreciated and represents once more another indication of the necessity for further research and work on the subject. We strongly believe that this partnership between COESPO and the African Union Commission will mark the beginning of an extensive liaison between the two institutions. This will undoubtedly enhance cooperation among different organizations across continents, and it will definitely have a positive impact on knowledge and learning. The enthusiasm shown by the presenters, the briefers, the themes discussed, and the global involvement are a proof of this. So I have to admit, I was personally moved by the experiences shared by the presenters today. We trust that this conference has been stimulating, we hope, and inspiring, and that our intent of drawing attention to the issue of protecting vulnerable communities, both through local enforcement and international support, has been at least partially successful. Today's talks ultimately aimed at recognizing the need for coordinated policies between countries and increased funding, which has been repeatedly emphasized to the lectures. So it is our duty and responsibility as an international community to protect individuals who are defenseless and cannot protect themselves. So to implement policies in order to guarantee an equal and effective enjoyment of human rights is a duty of us all. Vulnerability derives from social structures which distribute power unequally and limit access to state services and assistance. So together, we must address the cries for help from the most disadvantaged. Alone, we can do so little, but together we can do so much. So thank you again, everyone. And it is now with a great honor that I pass the word to U.S. Army Colonel William Daniel, which is COESPO Deputy Director, and he will offer the closing remarks and close this enlightening webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita, for those words and for the introduction. I just want to take some time to acknowledge the time and work put forth by those who contributed to today's webinar. I think it highlights the need for developing actionable recommendations that we can provide our leaders as they struggle with these very important topics. Acknowledging that by working by, with, and through our partners on the ground, will we only be able to develop solutions that are sustainable. So I would like to say on behalf of Brigadier General Giovanni Pietro Barbano, the COESPO Director, once again, I'd like to extend my sincerest gratitude to the organizers and panelists of this webinar on the protection of vulnerable groups in domestic policing and peace support operations. Also, I'd just like to take a minute to go down the list of our presenters. I know just to highlight the breadth and depth of experience of those who've now created a community from which everyone can draw upon to, like I mentioned earlier, provide our leaders with actionable recommendations. So from the African Union, we had Mr. Lefoko Kesamange, Mr. Sabelo Bokazi, Ms. Nina Thundu, Mr. Roberto Casane. Apologies if I've mispronounced your names. From the East African Standby Force, Colonel Ali Mohammed Roble, the Rwandan National Police, Mr. Assistant Commissioner David Butari. From Mogadishu, the EUCAP representatives, Ms. Ellen Vermeulen, Mr. Mohad Bhutan. From Padova, Ms. Silvia Golan. From the Italian Carabinieri here at COESPU, Lieutenant Colonel Marco Suto. Our esteemed former UNHCR head, Ms. Alessandra Morelli. Our expert in social development, Ms. Luisa Gateski. And finally, from United States Africa Command, Lieutenant Colonel Elizabeth Coffey. I just want to extend my severe gratitude to you for taking time out of your busy day and presenting on this very crucial topic. More locally, my team here on the ground at COESPU, I'd like to extend my thanks to Colonel Nicola Bianchi and his team at the Department of Studies and Research, as well as Lieutenant Colonel Federico Vecchi, our gender advisor, as well as Margarita Corti, our moderator and co-moderator. It's been a very insightful, thought-provoking discussion. I think has shed some light on some topics that we all realize exist, but may not know the extent or may have not considered all of these topics at once. Definitely gives us a newfound commitment, maybe a deeper understanding of the challenges that our peacekeepers and law enforcement face when downrange in very hostile environments. So I would ask everyone to think about ways to help these peacekeepers and law enforcement officers with, once again, actionable recommendations for what they can do to prevent or to help protect vulnerable groups and populations. I would say that in conclusion, the work is not finished. This is, we had a lot of nice things to say to each other. We talked about a lot of important issues, but I would suggest that this is just a moment in time where we've had the chance to reflect on these topics. I think the real work will be done downrange amongst our colleagues in theater, as well as in the classrooms as we prepare those individuals to go downrange. Also, just in closing, I'd be remiss not to mention Brigadier General Andrea Paris and his efforts within the African Union to bring this webinar to fruition. So once again, thank you all who participated. Thank you all who dialed in to follow the events. I hope you'll join us in the future for initiatives like this. I would also ask that you join us on our social medias, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, just to stay abreast of activities like this in the future, as well as feedback from folks that are in the field doing this important work. So thank you. Arrivederci.
Sir, good. Thank you so much for your words. Now it's time to close. From COESPU, from all of us, thank you so much for joining us today. I would like to wish you a nice evening and goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.